Welcome, everybody. I'm joined by Eric once again, and we're here to talk about the 5 tips that we have for new and returning players for the Lord of the Rings TCG. But actually, I want to give Eric a chance at the front here to just plug 2 new channels he has. I think people might be familiar with the Library of Orthonc. We have a new channel as well. You guys should go check it out. Like, subscribe. It's in the video description if you guys want to check that out. But you want to just give a quick pitch on each of them?
Oh yeah, thanks, Matt. So yeah, the channel that we've had going on for a while now, since earlier this year, is Library of Orthonc, LOTR TCG. That's a Lord of the Rings TCG variety channel. It covers only Lord of the Rings TCG, but all types of content, openings, a lot of deck techs, and stuff like that. So definitely, obviously, subscribe to that if you're into the Lord of the Rings TCG, which is what we're talking about today. And then did just recently start up a brand new channel on Young Jedi. That's always been a passion of mine. And I said, hey, we should get one of those going too. So there's a brand new Young Jedi CCG channel, and that's called the Jedi Council Young Jedi CCG. So definitely check that out as well. We're going to continue to post weekly videos on both these channels for the foreseeable future. So
yeah, that's great, man. I love this community of people kind of coming together to make content. And unlike me, Eric's actually really good at this stuff. So his tutorials are actually thoughtful. But let's get to the topic at hand. We have 5 sort of tips and suggestions for new and returning players to improve your gameplay, stuff to think about. Some of these are going to be basic, but others, it's like you may not be just a really casual gamer. Hopefully these will be helpful, and maybe some veterans will learn a thing or two, or sort of think about it. So I put together a slide deck. This is great, so feel pretty high tech here, but here's our lovely alerts here. But let's get to our first tip here. So you want to go through this, and we'll kind of go back and forth here a bit about moving and pacing.
Yeah, sure thing. So this is one of the things, kind of focusing on what makes Lord of the Rings unique from other TCGs and how this might play out differently than, like a battle-based game like, Magic the Gathering or something like that. So, and Lord of the Rings has skirmishes to it, but a lot of the game is related to the strategy of, as we say here, moving and pacing. Is how quickly are you doing things, meaning how quickly in game timing, not speed of play. But
right, it's a race. You have to think
it's a race. So the game is a race. They had a promotion at one point called Race to Mount Doom, and that you could honestly describe the Lord of the Rings trading card game as it is a race to Mount Doom. The first surviving ring bearer to live through Site 9 in this game, or conceptually Mount Doom, is the winner of the game. So the fact is your win condition is to get there first. That's right. one of the 2 main ways you win. The other way you win is by killing your opponent's ring bearer completely prior to the Site 9. So if you get going too fast and get piled up against too many minions and you lose your ring bearer, well, then you lose. So that's where it's trying to move as quickly as possible, but not so fast that you die, is basically the object of the game here, just at a large scale level.
Which I think it's easy to forget that that's what you're trying to do, because it's like more fun to like pile on. Like you want to get your cool orc site, you want to get your cave troll, and you forget like, no, actually getting to Site 9 is the win condition. It's not battling, right? But that's like an instinct I think every gamer has, is like that battling function almost.
Yeah, yeah. And we'll talk about the battling a little later on. Battling is a little different in this game too, I think, than some other games. But yeah, kind of adding on to that concept of, obviously being that moving is important, and whoever gets there first wins. Obviously there's a big advantage to going first. And the big advantage to going first is obviously you're going to have the first shot. If you move at the same pace as your opponent, you would get there first. So at some point they'll have to move an additional time than you to pass you. So that's the big advantage of bidding those higher burdens to get to go first. Is going first is a big advantage in a race game. But the disadvantage that goes along with that, in particular if you're playing movie block and earlier, is that when you go first, you get to play your first site, but then basically the rest of the game, unless you're playing site manipulation, the rest of the game you're playing on all of your opponent's sites, because by you being ahead, your opponent gets to keep playing the next site. So that's something to be aware of. It's something I think to help balance out the pacing of it. But and as it pertains to the more extended formats, expanded, standard, some of those, site manipulation becomes very important in those formats, and, you know, turn into a whole nother ordeal with the site path. But just kind of focusing on the more basic site paths, still the concept is your opponent gets to play their sites out of their site path as long as you're in the lead. So that's again, something just for newer people to be kind of aware of, that that's what, you know, you don't realize this till you pick up the game. When you're done, you're like, oh, I won that game, and this site 1 is mine, site 2 through 9 all belong to my opponent. And that's if you remained ahead the whole game. That's what the layout is going to be. So
yeah. What about the importance of sanctuaries a little bit? It's so easy to forget.
Yeah, so I would say, especially, again, if you're playing movie block and Sooner, where there's not, you know, manipulation of healing sites like Mythland or weird stuff like that, you know, sanctuaries are very critical in movie block and Sooner, because you need to stop basically to heal. If you don't stop to heal, it's a high likelihood that your companions are just going to die off if your opponent has even a decent defense. So what that means is, when you're timing out your moves, you want to try to time out to stop at 3 and to stop at 6. And then what it also means, of course, is if you are doing a double, or excuse me, if you're doing a triple move, if you can like triple from 3 to 6, that's just amazing, because you're just going from one sanctuary to another. Or if you can triple from 6 to 9, going from a sanctuary to the end of the game, you know, some of those types of plays are you highly benefit from where the sanctuaries appear on the site path. So always be aware of where the sanctuaries are, because, you know, if you're at site 4, for example, you may be very incentivized to double into 6 because you're at the sanctuary. It doesn't matter if you took some extra wounds, because you're going to be taking them off. Because if you just single into 5, then you're probably going to want to single into 6 also, and then you've probably lost because you're moving too slow. So
yeah, that goes back to like the pacing with your opponent, like keeping in mind, where's your opponent at, right? Like, you gotta beat them to 9 ultimately. That's the goal.
Correct. And I will say, and this is just from my own experience playing the game, I will say that newer players tend to move more conservatively, and the games tend to take a really long time, versus if you're playing with more experienced people, it's like, man, you know, as a newer player, like, man, I am really surprised that person is moving so fast, and, oh, they're moving so fast, they're losing companions, and, you know, how are they doing that? But again, all you got to do is survive with just your ring bearer at site 9 to win the game. So it's not, you know, you're not trying to preserve your full board or anything like that. You're trying to get there as quickly as possible. And that's something, again, that pace with your opponent. But if you are playing a more experienced opponent there and you're a newer player, they're going to be moving probably faster than you're comfortable with. So that's where it helps, obviously, to play with the same skill level and learn the game together, you know?
Yeah. All right, so moving and pacing, that's our first sort of suggestion. Next one here, drawing cards is worse and discarding is better than in most CCGs. Do you want to talk about this a little bit, Eric?
Yeah, and this again is somewhat intuitive, and again, in any card game, as you know, people who are familiar with CCGs know, generally drawing cards is one of the best things you can do, because resource advantage, meaning having more cards in your hand, having more options to play, is paramount. You know, that's still true in Lord of the Rings, that having those extra resources is more important. But what's different in Lord of the Rings is, by discarding a card in your regroup phase, you automatically get to draw to replace that card. Or just by playing more cards to the table, you get to draw more cards automatically to replace those cards. So it's kind of like, you know, again, to compare it like to Magic, every card is a cantrip. You know, you might not get the draw immediately, but in your regroup phase, you're getting to redraw that hand. So there's a lot of incentive just to play cheap cards to the table. You know, a simple concept of this might be is like, I play a lot of Fellowship Draft, which, you know, sometimes the card quality is very low, and a 0 cost condition might just be a good card because it costs 0. You put it to the table and get it out of your hand, and you get to draw a new card for it. So that's kind of the concept here, is whether you're discarding a card or playing it to the table, you always get to replace it. So what that means is you have a pretty good ability to draw cards on your own. You always get to discard one additional card every turn. There's the mechanic muster, lets you discard more cards. But again, the point is because every discard comes with a delayed draw, the ability just of a pure draw is not as beneficial other than, again, if you can do it in the fellowship phase to have more cards to play right away, that can be beneficial. But again, looking at the other concept here to be aware of is when you're looking at draw a card in this game, your deck is 50-50 fellowship versus shadow. And so if you draw 2 cards, you're probably only really drawing 1 card that's going to be immediately beneficial to you. And that other one, it would have made no difference if you had just regrouped it into your hand or if you just drew it. So again, because you're only playing with half your cards at a time and your deck's 50-50, a draw is almost like half a draw. So that's also something to kind of be aware of that's, again, unique about this game where that's different from, you know, like, again, Star Wars, you're playing with your light side, dark side in separate decks, and you're going to be able to immediately use whatever you draw. That's, you know, not the case with, you know, with this game.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the sort of golden rule is like cards are, you know, like a mill deck or something. It's like essentially like more cards is better. And if you run out of cards, then you lose. But this is a little bit different because cycling is much more common and easier to do, I think, right? It's sort of like built into the gameplay. All right.
Yeah. And when we talk about cycling, it's usually an ability on a card. Like, you know, 2 of the main ones, just use like Fellowship as an example that people are familiar with, is, you know, like Gwemigal, Arwen's weapon, lets you discard cards, you know, just as many times as you want to, you know, give her +1 strength. So the +1 strength isn't great, but discarding 2 cards might actually be very good. Or like goblins have a condition, They Are Coming, that lets you discard 3 cards. And again, discard 3 is just going to help you cycle your deck very quickly. And so cards with those kind of recurring activated abilities that let you just dump cards can actually be very strong. You have to manage your deck size, of course, when you're doing that, where you don't, if you play a 30-card deck and you're throwing cards out to They Are Coming all the time, you're going to run out of cards. You know, you probably want to go up to more like 40 if you're playing that strategy. But that's something you'll get more experienced on as a newer player over time, is looking at how quickly does my deck cycle? Do I have abilities like Arwen or They Are Coming? And also, how much do my cards cost? You know, like, am I playing a whole bunch of Nazgul that cost like 6 and 8? Or am I playing a bunch of Moria minions that cost 1 and 2? It, again, very much impacts how quickly you're cycling, because, like I said before, a card played to the table is also a cycled card. And so that Moria with the small minions is going to cycle a lot faster than a Nazgul with big minions.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. All right, let's get into a third one here. Twilight Management. This is something, it's way easier to say this than to do it, but managing that Twilight is so important. And, you know, it goes back to this bigger concept of resource management, right? But you're essentially managing your opponent's resources rather than like your own, but your choices are feeding into that.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. And again, this is, you know, a lot of these tips are getting to the resource management aspect of a game, because when you look at actual, you know, any CCG, when you distill it down to what are you playing, is generally you're playing a resource management game. And, you know, what's unique about Lord of the Rings is, as you said, the Free People's player controls the Shadow's resources. So if the Free People's player goes really big, then the Shadow player can play more minions. If the Free People's player plays really small and chokes, then the Shadow can't do much. So that's a very unique concept about this game. So there are decks that take advantage of that on both sides, where you might do a flood, where you do a deck where you know, the most common thing here is like if you play like Ents with Saved from the Fire, and you just put out Gandalf and you burn a companion and you put down 3 big Ents, and, you know, you put 20 Twilight into the pool just on the basis of, hey, that's more Twilight than my opponent can use anyway, so I'm just going to put it all down at once, and then they're just going to lose the unused Twilight at the end of the turn. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got decks that'll play a small number of companions and very low cost cards, as well as potentially cards that might allow removal of Twilight, and then just choke your opponent so that they can't play very many minions. And then it has, you know, kind of going back to the last point we just made, it has a negative effect on their ability to cycle. So not only do they not get to play their shadow cards, their hand is clogged up with shadow cards, so then they can't get through to their Free People's cards that they're trying to play on their next turn. So that's where, you know, the choke / the flood can be a really interesting dynamic in this game. obviously most of the fair decks seek to do that at a balanced level, but there are decks out there that try to choke Twilight and decks that try to flood Twilight, and be aware if you're playing against a deck like that, as far as how you play your deck would be very different depending on if your opponent's doing one of those strategies.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like the age-old debate in CCGs is how to fix mana screw, right? Like every game has this resource and it's similar to mana, whatever it's called. And I love this game because I just circumvented, like, no, we're not even going to bother with that. Like, it's actually you're contributing to the Twilight pool. There's no like lands to generate or force to whatever. It's like we're going a totally different creative route. And I really do applaud the creativity of this game for that sort of engine, which I think is pretty unique in the, I don't know, 15 to 20 CCGs that I've encountered.
Yeah, I would say so. And I think the nice thing they do about it too is, if you look at choke in particular, you can get away with choke very easily early in the site path because the sites don't give much Twilight and there's roaming minions. But then when you get later on into the site path and those minions are no longer roaming, they don't have that penalty, and the sites themselves start giving, 6, 7, 8, 9 Twilight, it makes it really hard to choke then anyway. So, progressively more minions are going to come out regardless because of how they design the site path, which is also another, I think, kudos to the design team for developing the game that way.
Yeah. Moving on to our next one, which is sort of this idea of board control. I love this first bullet that you put here, is like free people's everything is permanent, right? Because there's way less flexibility, and like, yeah, you can add more cards, but like you're not clearing the board like Shadow is every time. It's like way more long-term decision making with your fellowship and sort of how you choose to utilize them.
Yeah, and I think as a new player in particular, that's the biggest thing to get used to, is because in most games you're used to like looking for like fighting parity. Is like, oh, we should be winning an equal number of skirmishes or whatnot. And, this game is set up to be, by no means should the free peoples be winning everything, because the concept is the free peoples, generally have higher vitality and are staying on the table longer. So the point is they're supposed to just sit there. They're supposed to lose skirmishes. They're supposed to take wounds, and, minions, regardless of how good they are, as you said, going to get swept off the table at the end of the turn. So that's where, kind of like the second point here, it's okay to lose skirmishes and even lose characters. In general, the free people's player, even though everything is permanent, especially the losing skirmishes part, you're going to lose a heck of a lot of skirmishes in Lord of the Rings. So don't expect that like, oh, I've got all my guys down and they got their right weapons, and they, that could be perfectly fine, and you could still be losing, a number of skirmishes every single turn. That doesn't mean anything was wrong. It just is the aspect of this game, is that it's kind of an attrition game, not attrition in the sense of Star Wars, but a game where you build up those wounds over time.
I think it's just very counterintuitive, because I think, with like Magic, like, it's like thinking of winning, like you want to win or block or whatever, like, but as you get farther into even Magic, you start to realize, like, yeah, your life is just a resource as well.
Yeah.
This is just like a very different way of thinking.
But yeah, if you keep losing a bunch of creatures off the table in Magic and your opponent isn't, you're going to be in a world of hurt. Versus in this game, it's your minions are getting swept off at the end of the turn either way. And your free peoples, you get 9 of them and only one of them needs to survive. That's kind of the other point there about it's okay to lose characters, is, yeah, you've got 9 guys. Don't willingly try to lose them early on too often, unless it's an intentional kind of speed bump burn companion that you're trying to get rid of, which is more atypical. In general, lose characters when you have to, but it is okay to lose characters because you've got 9 and you only have to have 1. You only need 1 to win. So that's another interesting concept there. But Shadow, kind of the extension of that is building up a heavy support area for Shadow can really help your deck function. And that's how a lot of the Shadow decks snowball. If you think of a deck like Ninja Golem, it's all about building up all these ridiculous conditions in your support area. If you look at like even Goblin Armory, you get a few armories, or Dunland, you get a few hides. They're building up that support area of your Shadow permanents. It helps you as you progress, or, you know, your besiegers and you're building up a whole bunch of engines, and then suddenly you're playing trolls for, you know, 0 or 2 mana or Twilight. You know, it's something that, as far as board control, the shadow player's trying to build up that resource in the support area, and the Free People's player needs to be aware of what the shadow's doing so that they're kind of constantly chipping away at that support area. Or, you know, if your deck's designed right, you know, maybe sweeping that support area once or twice a game just to clean it out. That's the huge aspect of board control as it comes for the shadow side of things.
All right, let's get into our final tip. So that was board control and sort of the importance of it. This is a basic one, but I think it's easy to forget as well, knowing the game limits, right? And these are sort of 3 rules that to sort of follow. But the rule of 4, I always forget about the card limit.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was instituted very early on to stop excessive drawing in the fellowship phase. So the rule of 4, just a couple, you know, basic things for newer players to know about that. It means you can only draw 4 cards in the fellowship phase. That includes taking cards into hand. What it doesn't include is playing cards from the draw deck. So if something says play it from your draw deck directly to the table, that doesn't violate the rule of 4. If something says take it into your hand from your draw deck, that does count as part of the rule of 4. So, and again, the rule of 4 also only applies during the fellowship phase. So one classic example of that is like the Gandalf from Moria, I forget what it's called, the one that says at the start of each of your turns, draw a card. Well, again, that's not a fellowship phase. That's at the start of your turn. So you get that card draw. That's irrespective of the rule of 4. You could still draw 4 cards during the fellowship phase. So,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's about all I have to say about that, is just, you know, be aware of that and don't build a deck that's going to try to overdraw. And, you know, you usually won't have a problem with that. But it's, you know, if you're trying to play a more abusive deck earlier on in the game, you could run into it.
This is just like a reminder with all CCGs. It's just remember the small print on your cards, right? Like it's sometimes hard to remember all the functions. And like that Gandalf you're describing, it's not the fellowship. It's actually the beginning of your turn. And like it's like remembering the intricacies of all these cards and how they're slightly different.
Yeah.
What about the rule of 9, though?
So the rule of 9 is just the fact that says you can have 9 companions on the table or in the dead pile. Between those 2 areas, maximum of 9. So it's basically saying, you know, and if you look at most good deck making, you know, I'd say maybe 75% of decks, you'll see them play 9 companions because they want to take advantage of their ability to go all the way up to 9. The other thing, I guess, with the rule of 9 to be aware of just from a technical standpoint, again, is if you have a shadow card that discards one of your companions, or if you're like Merry or Pippin and you discard yourself, discarding a companion to the discard pile is not violating the rule of 9. Again, you're only counting companions in play and in the dead pile. And then, like, you know, you play expanded, for example, there's a card, Falls of Rauros, that lets you remove a character from the dead pile. So if you play that, you can actually end up playing 10 companions. You know, there's cards like Sent Back that let you play Gandalf, even if he's already in your dead pile. So there's some circumvention around these rules, which kind of is the corollary of this know the game limits, is also be aware of the cards that circumvent them, because it's probably pretty strong if you're breaking one of these rules. So that's kind of the few that I just rattled off at you. But that's mostly a deck making rule. Generally, what it means is you probably don't want to play more than 9 companions, because you don't want to get in a situation where you have a 10th companion that you want to play, but you're literally prevented from the game rule from playing it. So it's, you know, usually you'll see your deck at 9 unless you say, hey, I've got just like 5 companions and I know I've got a really good way to protect these 5 companions, and so I'm just not going to play more than those 5. That's fine. You generally don't want to go the other way, though, and say, hey, I'm going to play 10 companions or 11, you know?
Yeah. More is not always better. And I guess the final one is the move limit of 2, but you can do a triple move, right?
You can triple move. Well, you can do as many moves as you want if you increase the move limit enough. And that's, again, where it goes into what I was mentioning about if you break one of these rules of the game, you're probably a very strong card. So like Radagast is a staple of the movie block format simply because his text says the move limit is +1. And so being able to triple in particular is very good because, like we're saying, going from 3 to 6 or 6 to 9, just the way the site path is laid out, that's just hugely beneficial. There are some cards that reduce the move limit, but those are pretty few and far between. So, anything that gives you the ability to do those extra moves, especially if you do it like, hey, I'm gonna do a flood where I'm gonna put a ton of companions down and then I'm just gonna go straight and move. There's some very strong synergies with that.
All right, so that's our final tip here. So, the review, you have know the game limits, know the board control, Twilight Management's important. Drawing cards is actually not a great thing, and discarding is better. And then our first tip was moving and pacing. So that's sort of a basic outline. I know we covered a lot of information here. Well, Eric covered a lot of information. I just learned. It's great. But I think that's all the time we have for today. Eric, any kind of final thoughts on this?
No, I think that, again, hopefully this is educational for newer players just to kind of think about the game strategically and conceptually, because as you said, a lot of times that's your success at a CCG is knowing some of the basic components and then knowing how are my cards helping me get around some of these basic standard rules. And that's when, you truly kind of find out strategies to exploit and so forth. So I think that's true of any CCG, but hopefully this is helpful with some of the things to look at for Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, and like everything, this game's about getting reps in. You're going to be so much better after you play the game 50 times than your first 10 times. It's just like anything else. The game really, I think, the more I play it, the more I'm like, oh, this is a lot of fun. But if you just play it once and you're like, I didn't really get it, then you're kind of missing it, because I think there's a lot of intricacy there and a lot of fun to be had. So thanks for tuning, everybody. Check out Eric's channel, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And we'll catch you next time.